It seems that tank is the least played role in Marvel Rivals. If you're bronze, silver, or gold in ranked, you're probably accustomed to seeing 4 to 5 players in stock DPS or support, with tank always being that last role that's filled in your games. So why is it always like that? To be honest, there are many reasons. Tanks aren't as flashy as DPS, there's less direct action. When you mess up on tank, it tends to have a more significant impact to team success than if you mess up on other roles. But what it really comes down to is just most players don't know how to play tanks effectively. Tank is a role that you can carry games on, but it might not be as obvious as just getting kills or healing teammates. Throughout my playtime, I've narrowed down 7 concepts that can help you improve on tank, or if you're a DPS or support main, learn the game from a tank's perspective. And listen, I'm just a GM player. I'm not a guru or anything like that. I'm just an average guy with a 9 to 5 and I play this game in my free time. And I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to that. Just as a side note before we begin, I want to mention that we'll be focusing more on the macro fundamental aspects of the game, and these concepts are going to be abstract, but I'll be giving practical examples to showcase what I'm talking about. The first concept is knowing your tank hero's strengths and weaknesses. If you played hero shooters before, you probably are familiar with hero archetypes. And for those of you who don't know, there are generally 3 types of playstyles heroes fall under, these being poke, dive, and brawl. So let's start with poke tanks. These tanks have defensive abilities like shields and barriers to help mitigate damage. They usually have medium damage at a longer range than the other tanks, but they typically do have low mobility. Poke tanks generally want to play at the front line to anchor the team. They'll play at a medium to long range and whittle down resources from the enemy team as they get closer. And the tanks that fall under this archetype are Doctor Strange and Magneto. Dive tanks have mobile abilities that allow them to traverse the map quickly and attack from short to medium ranges. They have burst sustain abilities to allow them to stay in the fight longer, but they do have low damage. Dive tanks generally want to act as disruptors, and they want to skip the frontline shenanigans and go straight for either the enemy's backline or isolated targets to force cooldowns and secure kills. They play all around the map depending on what opportunities are given, and the tanks that fall under this archetype are Hulk, Captain America, and Venom. And lastly, the brawl tanks have high damage abilities that allow them to have windows for aggression. They have some sustain, such as either self-healing or shield generation, usually medium mobility, but they need to get most of their value from short ranges. These tanks want to play sometimes in the front line, at an off angle or a flank, and it really just depends on the tank. They feel more DPS-y than other tanks, and the tanks that fall under this archetype are Thor, Groot, Penny Parker, and the Thing. Another thing you should know is that most of these tanks have certain abilities that allow them short windows of time to act like a tank in another archetype. An example would be Thor using his Lightning Strike ability to attack at long range distance, and this allows him to act like a poke tank for a few seconds, say at the start of a fight. Another example would be Doctor Strange using his AoE short-range burst damage ability at full charge to punish lower HP targets that get too close. This allows him to have brawl tank capability, so the enemies must respect him at close range. And another example would be Captain America using his shield block from short range, say to deflect Thor's lightning strikes back at him, and this makes him kind of have more of a frontline presence. You generally want to play at your tank's optimal range for as long as you can, but you'll have abilities and windows of time to get creative and change up your playstyle. It's not as simple as, say if you're playing Cap, just dive the backline, or if you're playing Thor, just walk forward and play aggressively. Tanks are multi-dimensional in this game, and instead of it being black and white in terms of each tank's general playstyle, it would look something more like this. The second concept is to create space effectively. You've probably already heard this one before, but what exactly does it mean? After all, nobody logs into a game and says, hey, let's create some space today. All this means is that you lead your team into battle and you dictate the tempo of the fight. So let's start with leading your team. Most of the time your DPS and supports are not going to initiate the fight before you do, unless you have a feeding Spider-Man. So you must take initiative of where your team fights and when your team fights. Are you going to fight from the high ground to start the fight? Where do you want to hold on defense? Which pathing or route do you want to take to get to the objective on attack? These are all questions you should be thinking about before starting the fight. If you're indecisive and not sure about what you're doing, it'll trickle down to the rest of the team. Always be decisive and follow through. Even if you make the wrong decision or it doesn't work out how you intended, you can always go back to the drawing board and formulate a new plan for future fights. Alright, next let's talk about tempo. You want your team to fight either aggressively, passively, or neutrally. It all depends on which team has the clear advantage. Fighting aggressively is when your team has the clear advantage. Aggressive tempo can look like when an ally is using their ultimate, when you have a positional advantage, when you force a lot of the enemy's high value cooldowns, or when you have a numbers advantage, meaning that your team has more players in the fight than the enemy team. This is whenever you walk forward and take more space as the tank. Fighting in the neutral means that neither team has a clear advantage. Nobody is using ultimates, nobody is at major risk of dying, and everybody is generally in a comfortable position. The neutral is usually the start of team fights where players are trying to gain an advantage, whether it be to execute a strategy, gain a position, or to capitalize on a mistake that the enemy team makes. Think of a Magneto or Strange at a range to whittle down enemy resources, Captain America or Hulk staging to dive the enemy team's backline, or Thor or Groot attacking the enemy team's front line to create an opening to kill a vulnerable enemy. Fighting passively is when your team has the clear disadvantage. Passive tempo can look like when an enemy team is using an ultimate, when an enemy has a positional advantage, when the enemy team has forced valuable cooldowns from your team, or when the enemy team has a numbers advantage. This is when you back up to a position you can hold or out of the fight completely to prioritize your team's life over anything else. The two mistakes tanks make when it comes to tempo control are feeding and playing scared. So feeding is whenever you're playing too aggressively when you need to be playing neutrally or passively. And then playing scared is whenever you're playing too passively when you need to be playing more neutrally or aggressively. Make sure you're dictating your team's tempo accordingly and not being the one that is waiting on your DPS or supports to do it. Concept 3 is drawing attention and applying pressure effectively. Tanks can utilize map control, target selection, and consistent damage to do this. Map control is a key concept you must understand to win team fights. You need to be able to recognize which area of the map your team controls and which area the enemy team controls. The way you do this is by using corners. These give you the most protection for your team more than anything else. It tells your team this is the area that's safe and that is the area that's dangerous. So if you're Magneto, you need to utilize corners to establish your front line and apply pressure or consistent damage to force the enemy team back so you can control more of the map. As Thor, you play the corner until you see an opening to attack an isolated or weak enemy, then move back to your team to apply pressure to the enemy tank and get healed by your supports. Dive tanks are a little more unique in that they can use their mobility to enter and exit the enemy team's space efficiently. So as Cap, you can dive a DPS or support to draw attention from the enemy team, which will then create openings for the rest of your team to follow up on. But you do have to be aware of how long you stay there, as you are in the enemy's team space after all. In all three scenarios, you draw the enemy team's attention to create opportunities for you and the rest of your team to make plays and secure kills. If you have another tank, your job gets a lot easier. You can utilize off angles to attack the enemy team, making them decide whether to attack you or the main angle. You can also use your high health pool to stay in the space for longer than a DPS typically could. So if you're Magneto and you have Doctor Strange on your team, let him take the main angle while you take another angle, even high ground, to give yourself a better sight line to attack a DPS or support. If you're Thor and you have a Strange and a Black Panther, you can let Strange hold the front line while you dive the enemy team's supports when your Black Panther goes in. When you do these types of things, you draw attention from the enemy, which makes them have to make multiple decisions and they have to deal with multiple threats at the same time. Alright, so let's talk about target selection. So the worst thing you can do on tank is tunnel visioning on the enemy team's tank for the entire game. Yes, there are going to be a lot of times where you need to attack the tank, but You always want to be aware of where the other enemies are on the field. Things like a Hell on high ground, a Punisher on a strong off angle, or a Psylocke flanking. These are all targets you can focus on to force them off the position they want to take. The result is your team will take less pressure. So use your ranged attacks on Magneto to pressure a Storm in the air. Use your movement on Thor or Cap to close the distance on a Hawkeye and pressure him off of high ground. By drawing attention, applying pressure at the right targets in the right time, and using off angles, flanks, and dives when you can, these force the enemy to make a decision. So do they attack you? Do they attack the other tank that is pressing forward? Do they go for support? Do they focus the flanker in the backline? The point is, the more decisions the enemy team has to make, the more mistakes that they make. Alright, so concept 4 is all about peeling. This is an underrated job that a tank has, and it's often overlooked. If your team dies, you die. It may sound obvious, but how do you mitigate your team from dying? As a tank, you need to recognize that sometimes in the match, you need to play the role of the bodyguard. In other words, help and protect your supports and DPS whenever they're in a clear disadvantage. So the enemy team stages a dive in your backline, or you see your DPS in a 1v2 on a flank, or the enemy tank goes past you and ults your entire team. These are all examples of when you need to peel. And you do this by utilizing a combination of damage, body blocking, and stun, displacement, and defensive cooldowns. So say your Hawkeye is on high ground by himself and a Psylocke flanks him. If you're Thor, you can use your movement to displace the Psylocke, pushing her further back from your Hawkeye, and then damage her to either kill her or at least force her out and make her go on the retreat, therefore shutting down her play. In another scenario, say the enemy Strange ults your Luna Snow. As Magneto, bubble the Luna, cut off the Strange's sightline by getting in between the two. This is what body blocking is, and then damage him to force him back. In this scenario, the body block was important because it provided extra protection for your support. You utilize your big hitbox and high health pool to literally be a meat shield for a few seconds. Body blocking specifically is something I never see tank players do, but it provides so much value even if it doesn't initially seem like it does. The fifth concept is the resource battle. Think of this game as a mix of a shooter game, an action game, and a MOBA game. Most people get the shooter and the action game comparisons, but it's also important to understand the MOBA elements that this game has incorporated. If you've played a MOBA game like League of Legends or another hero shooter like Overwatch, you know that having more resources than the other team is a huge advantage in winning the team fight. Resources are things like number of ultimates your team has ready, HP, ability cooldowns, and number of allies. It's important to adopt the mindset of forcing the enemy team's best resources on cooldown before you even expect to get a kill. These best resources usually come from supports like Loki's Immortality Totems, Adam Warlock's Soul Link, and crowd control abilities like Mantis' Sleep. For DPS, some examples are Hell's Bird, Namor's Turrets, and Wolverine's Shield passive. The Wolverine one is a huge one for tanks. Wolverine is my worst nightmare. Always try to force that passive ASAP. For tank, there's Penny Parker's Mind Nest, Magneto's Bubble Shield, and Self Shield, and then the Hulk's Bubble Shield. As a tank, you should focus on forcing these valuable resources so you and your team can capitalize from it. Since you have the HP and sustain cooldowns, it's generally easier for you to do this compared to other roles. Ult tracking the enemy team and getting value out of your ults can single-handedly win you games. Even if you can guarantee one kill, it's worth it. And if you can use it to kill a support, it's even more value. You don't have to get a team wipe every single time you use your ult. Getting one kill can lead to a snowball, but you do have to be aware of which ults the enemy team has. The rule on this is that each hero should have their ult after 1 to 2 fights. So if it's been a long fight or 2 shorter fights, they're probably near getting their ult if they don't have it already. If it's too much to track every single ultimate, then just focus on the ones that annoy you the most. As a tank, I can tell you Moon Knight and his ultimate is the most annoying and he gets it pretty fast. It's almost impossible to react to this ultimate on most tanks, so if he hasn't used it in a while, be aware of his positioning and proactively move or attack him before he tries to cast the ult. Last thing on ultimates is to keep track of your ult economy and use your ults accordingly. A lot of lower rank players will all spam their ults at the same time to win team fights. It might seem like a good idea just to secure the fight win, but now every player in your team has to build their ult back from zero, and the enemy team will have their ults for the next fight, which almost guarantees your team losing the next fight and losing momentum. If you ever watched high rank play, you'll notice a certain ebb and flow to when players use your ultimates. There's almost like a rhythm to it. Like one team will play aggressive to force a defensive ultimate from the enemy team. The other team will then match the enemy team's defensive ultimate with one of their own. After that's over, a DPS will use an ult, then a tank will use theirs to counter that. It's a good idea to get in the habit of waiting a second or two before using your ult so you don't stack. As a tank, you need to understand that you have much more HP than the other two roles. This is a huge resource that is balanced by a big hitbox, and in other words, you're easier to hit, but you have the sustained numbers for more leeway. But the best resource in the game for any role, but I especially see a lot of tank players not doing this, the best resource is natural cover. It can get a little tricky in this game because there is some natural cover that is destroyable, but get in the habit of positioning around cover whenever you can, because it will save you from wasting resources, and it'll also give your supports an easier time to heal you. Concept 6 might seem a little generic, but it's to have awareness and adapt to the situation. The first point that I have here is about tunnel vision, and by this I mean focusing too much in the moment on what you're doing, leading to you not being aware of everything else that's going on around you. This is something I see many of my teammates make, and also including myself a lot of the time. If you solo queue like me most of the time, a lot of the advice that is given is just to focus on yourself and let your team just do whatever. While I do think this is good advice, as you can't control your team, you can only control yourself. I found that especially on tank, it helps to look around every now and then to fully grasp the reality of the situation. Another thing that I want to add is what I see tank players complaining about the most, and that's you felt like you should have been healed there, but you didn't. And this usually just leads to you thinking that your supports just suck, but unless your support is tilted or throwing intentionally, there usually is a good reason why you didn't get healed. Do they have any flankers? Your supports were probably fighting the flanker and healing each other while you were not using any natural cover and taking too much damage and wasting your cooldowns. So just know in the next fight you can utilize natural cover more to mitigate the damage, or turn around and help your team kill the flanker. Another scenario is whenever tanks W key in the neutral fight because you saw like an enemy support in the back line, half HP, and you wanted to secure the kill, but you just end up being dead in a second. This is usually because all 6 enemies focus fired you because you were out of position, and your supports, even if they use all their resources and they both double pocket you, a lot of times they can't out heal all that damage depending on how far out of position you went. So in reality, honestly, like, some of these situations might be the fault of all 3 roles. DPS weren't applying pressure, you were playing too aggressive, your other tank was playing too passive, your supports are playing way too safe. But at the end of the day, the point is to get good at recognizing how your team is playing and adapt to their playstyle, because if the tempo of your own team is off, it'll most likely lead to lost team fights. Okay, so I want to talk staggering. So this is something that can get you ranked up by itself, believe it or not, if you stop doing it. And for those of you who don't know, staggering is basically whenever you initiate a team fight when your team isn't fully regrouped. And players usually know this, but they usually don't have the patience to wait for their tanks and wait for the whole group to group up before initiating the team fight and going in and doing damage and healing and all that. A lot of players, they're kind of like stat sheet stuffers, you know. You got the cloak and daggers that want to get the high healing numbers, the punishers and moon knights that want to get the highest damage numbers. What a lot of people don't realize is that stats really don't matter. I mean, they do, but in terms of what the goal is just the objective. It's not stats at all. So all that matters is just getting that point to 100%, or getting the payload all the way to the end, or at least further than the enemy team, and that's really all that matters. So it's really important not to stagger, because this can actually lead to losing full-on objectives a lot of the times, and your team not even really realizing it and realizing like how bad that is. So it's good to just recognize when your team is staggering, and you always want to be the one in the team chat or in comms saying regroup, don't stagger, or wait for me, something like that. Because as a tank, your DPS and supports 95% of the times, if you say stuff like this, they aren't going to initiate the team fight without you, because most players do know that without their tank, there's not going to be any space created, and it's going to be a lot of pressure on them. So make sure to take the initiative on making sure that the team is regrouped. And if you stop doing this, or at least limit it as much as you can, this is actually something that can get you ranked up way faster if you just play the objective and you think about it from an objective standpoint and not just like a stat pad numbers perspective on the stat sheet. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to add to this concept is that I just want to say that you're not always going to be the main character. Sometimes you are, but you need to recognize whenever you aren't. This kind of works at 2 levels. So, you always hear tank gap, DPS gap, support gap, stuff like that. Sometimes it's just nonsense. Say like in a scenario where you won your first like 2 team fights in a row and you don't really know how, you were kind of like autopiloting and all of a sudden you just won the fight and you have no idea why. It's good to check the stat sheets in these moments if you don't really realize what is going on, just because you can recognize if your DPS is popping off or you have like really good supports. So say like you won your first team fights, you don't know why. Check the stat sheet and your DPS is 12 kills and 6 final hits already. In this case, you realize that there is a DPS gap there. You want to play in a way that will maximize their value. In this scenario, it could just be maybe like there's a flanking Psylocke on your team and they're doing a really good job. You can play in a way that will make their job easier, whether it's playing more aggressive whenever she goes in so they have to deal with you and her, or it could be like if you're Magneto, using the bubble shield to kind of add that extra protection while also playing aggressive on the target that she's shooting at. Just kind of recognizing whenever you have a teammate that is having a really good game and you just play in a way that maximizes their value. The other level that I kind of view this on is determining your team's win con. So what do I mean by this? It's usually regarding ultimates. So say like you have a Punisher that has his ultimate ready and nobody on your team is really close to getting their ultimate. So that Punisher is now your win con. So whenever he pops ult, you need to play in a way that will maximize his value. It could be shielding him on Doctor Strange. It could be maybe you're playing a dive tank like Venom. It could be diving in whenever he ults. So you distract the backline while he kills the tanks. It's good to recognize these things and determining what your team's win con is, because it's not always going to be you. Sometimes it will if you have your ultimate, but usually it'll be one of your teammates. And that fight specifically, it's good to just recognize that. All right, so we made it to concept 7, the last concept, and this is knowing team comp playstyles. So I'm kind of using this one as the icing on the cake. Everything kind of built up to this last one, and this is just kind of like the send-off concept. But this one kind of incorporates everything that we talked about a little bit. It's team comp playstyles, and it goes for your team as well as the enemy team. So the concept goes for all roles, but for this video, we'll stick from the tank's perspective. On the hero select screen, you always want to ask yourself, what range, what angle, what position does my team want to play from? And you always want to adapt to how your team is going to play and then fight from a position that will allow them to do their job effectively. This doesn't mean that you have to switch to a tank you don't want to play, but you can just change your play style. Like we mentioned before, a lot of tanks have like a general play style, but they have certain abilities or certain like windows where they can act like tanks from other archetypes. And then I would just save switching as a last resort. I wouldn't just default to counter swapping or swapping to something that fits with your team more. I know for a lot of players, we don't have a lot of time to master heroes, so I always say just stick to 2 to 3 per role. So for me, I only play tank, and I play Magneto, I play Thor, and I play Captain America. Depending on the map, say if my entire team's running dive for the most part, depending on the map, I might stay Magneto. So it just kind of depends on the map and the team comp. I'm just a strong believer in you can change your playstyle before you switch like 3 or 4 times. I've got a couple examples here of what this would kind of look like in game. So let's say you're solo tanking Thor and you have a Hawkeye, Iron Man, and Black Widow as DPS. Your DPS primarily want to poke from like a medium to long range, while you want to brawl from a close range. So there's a couple different strategies you can do here, but one that I want to mention is that you can use your lightning strike ability where he throws the lightning out, and you can use that for poke damage, and that'll allow your DPS to follow up and secure kills. You also position near your supports so that you kind of serve that barrier in between them and the enemy team. That will allow them to heal you and the team pretty easily without having to worry about the enemy team walking on them for free. Changing your position to maybe like a less aggressive playstyle for Thor would be good here. Obviously, there's going to be windows where you need to be aggressive and push the point and everything. This is one that you could play like a little bit more passive, prioritize getting your lightning strike, and then finding windows to close the distance and then brawl. So you're not just brawling by yourself and all 6 enemies are targeting you. Another example would be Magneto. Say you're playing Magneto and then you have a Venom, Black Panther, and Magic on your team. All of these heroes want to close the distance as soon as possible and deal damage at short range, while you generally want to keep a little bit of distance and then poke from long range. In this scenario, you can adopt an aggressive playstyle for Magneto because he's usually more of like a neutral or kind of like a slower tempo tank. If your team's playing really fast, you can also adapt your playstyle to kind of fit into that. So you can attack the enemies that your team is targeting. So say like they all go backline. You can bubble your Black Panther so he doesn't get CC'd, or you can bubble your Magic whenever they're low HP, so it'll give your supports an easier time to heal them. While all at the same time, you're applying your own pressure and you're kind of pushing forward as if you're playing a brawl tank. But because you have all of that help with you in doing that, it makes your job as Magneto easier to play that aggressive playstyle. And as far as recognizing the enemy team comp, this is also really important. You always want to recognize how the enemy team wants to play. So in the Thor example that I was talking about earlier, let's say they have a Doctor Strange and a Psylocke, and the Doctor Strange's shield provides cover from poke damage, but you also know that he doesn't want to necessarily be really close to you and just brawl for a long period of time, since you're more of a threat at closer range. As your team gets into position, you can use your long distance lightning strike ability to melt his shield. It's actually like pretty easy to melt his shield with that just because it does so much damage. So if you do that, melt his shield and it breaks, it gives your sniper heroes a lot easier time of like spamming damage or clicking heads on the enemy's DPS or supports. And then so say like they also have a Psylocke too, so you know that she's going to be wanting to flank your backline and also your DPS, since she kind of has the advantage there in terms of Black Widow versus Psylocke, Hawkeye versus Psylocke. Psylocke, whenever she closes the distance, will have the advantage there. So it'll be good to just to be aware that you already know what she's going to do before she does it. So whenever she does attack your backline, or say like your Black Widow's isolated on high ground and she goes for her, you can use your movement to get up to the Black Widow and kind of play like that bodyguard peel role that we talked about earlier. So it kind of shuts down her play. It will be a little risky since you're the only tank, because you have like quick movement with Thor. Like you can dash around pretty easily and pretty often. You can always dash around like back and forth to wherever you need to go, whether that's like backline or DPS, or if you're making your own play, playing aggressive. So another thing that I want to mention is to utilize team ups as much as possible, while also being aware of which team ups the enemy team has. So the best example that I have for this is say like the Magneto Scarlet Witch team up. It gives Magneto a completely new ability where he can use his sword attack, and I think it's like 95 damage per swing. So this kind of like makes him full out like a brawl tank for for 10 seconds because it does a lot of damage and it's just like consistent. Team ups are just free value that can change the game dramatically. So it's best to make sure you use these whenever you can. And I know that this whole concept is pretty nuanced, the whole team composition, but it's going to take time to get hang of. Obviously, you'll need to know, you'll have to have a lot of like hero knowledge, what every hero does, what they excel in, what their play style is. It just comes from playing the game, honestly. And a lot of heroes you'll see more often, and you'll know what to do and how they're going to want to play. So essentially it just comes down to identifying how your team wants to play and how the other team wants to play. Then you capitalize on and maximize on your team strategy and shut down the enemy team strategy. All right, and that wraps it up. I know this was a lot of information, but if you focus on like just one or two of these concepts per game until you get comfortable with them, you can rank up really fast by incorporating these types of things. I do want to mention that it's good to just continue to practice only one or two of these at a time. So you get to a point to where it's kind of just like intuition and you don't really have to actively think about this stuff. Whenever you catch yourself kind of doing things and you don't have to like think about it before, you don't have to think about all these different things at the same time, that's whenever you know that you're improving. There's one last thing that I need to mention, and it's just to keep a good mindset when you play. Don't tilt if something doesn't work out. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. Just view those mistakes as learning opportunities. I know that it kind of sounds corny and it's kind of generic, but it really is true. People don't pick up this game and they're just like masters at it from day one. They've had a lot of experience playing other games, or they just play the game a lot, so they learn faster. Even if you play this game 1 hour a week or 20 hours a week, just know that every time you mess up on something, don't give yourself that hard of a time. This is kind of like a fast-paced game with a lot of stuff going on, so it's going to take time to learn all this stuff. And really, a lot of this game, it comes down to just minimizing mistakes and capitalizing on enemies' mistakes. Once you find yourself doing that consistently, you'll be able to rank up in no time.